Good morning, everybody, and a big welcome from myself. I'm Gelda Glass. I'm the Assistant Director responsible for managing the collections at the Imperial War Museum, and Mark Barry, who's the Director responsible for work with our sector from Architype.
Good afternoon.
I thought it's worth you all knowing this is the very first time Mark and I have done this type of broadcast, which is fun and exciting, so bear with us if it isn't exactly perfect yet. Mark and I have been working together for about 3 years now, and we've been really working on how to bring sustainable solutions, design solutions, to the world of collection storage. And that's particularly interesting because I started that journey back at my very first analog museum conference in 1992. It was a storage conference, and it was such a different era to today. It was a very small group of people who were interested in really technical details about storage. And it was a time when, you know, the internet was still sort of used by the Ministry of Defence and very few museums. So it's a really nice opportunity today to be connecting with you all. And connection is one of the big themes that's come out of our work. What I think is really interesting about that is how it resonates even more strongly in the COVID era. So today, with you all, I'm going to advocate for connecting our collections and our audiences. If nothing else has come out of COVID, it's really clear to me that it's reminded us of the opportunity to fundamentally revolutionise the relationship between stored collections and our audiences. It's reminded me that sustainability as a solution can bridge the gap that we now face as a sector who are going to be daunted by the post-COVID era challenges of funding, and that we can achieve most by working together, connecting in ways like this. I'm going to share some really simple examples of how we thought outside of the box and took new ideas forward internally, and then Mark will go on to talk about the technical innovation in the projects which we've done. And I'd really encourage you to just try some of those ideas out, but equally, please share the ideas you've had. At the moment, this is one of the most innovative buildings in Europe, but it's Mark and my ambition that in maybe 5 years' time, we're coming to your conference papers and we're reflecting on how inadequate our innovation was, because we really think this is an area in which we can really start to change. I want to start in a really interesting place. I want to start with this picture because this very simple picture was how we pitched to our senior management team that we needed to invest in new storage. We were physically out of space. So we pitched to spend £3.6 million to place 80% of our collections in a new store. And we didn't do anything very complicated in that pitch. We presented a problem and some possible solutions. And this is one of the images of one of our technicians. And we asked our technicians and our photographers to go and photograph places on site that would make our executive and trustees reflect on the fact that it was possible. We did have the site. And because we had the space, we would be able to afford to do something differently. This team will feature throughout because one of the things which we did, which is a little bit unusual, is we tasked people throughout our organisation to go off and find out answers to questions. But this is where we started. We just need a bigger box. We then looked quite broadly at concepts around the severity and the likelihood of risk. So thinking about our collection and those risk factors, which we're all trained in and we all know really well. And this is the list of those for anybody who's joining us today from a non-museum or archival library background. These are put forward by Rob Waller, and they underpin most of the thinking that is enshrined in EU standards and the documents which we're all very familiar with. What happened when we started to think about these internally is we started to reflect on the fact that the passive house models that we knew about from domestic architecture and we knew about because we'd sent a study team to Denmark always made these risks easier to manage, simpler and cheaper to look at in terms of design solutions. And I'd really encourage you in your projects to take this list and think about what the type of approach to the architectural solution is going to do to them. We have a history as an organisation, for those of you who don't know Imperial War Museums, of having stratified our storage over a very long period based on how we use those collections, so that we really understand how we're managing the connection with our audiences and access. So this is one of our first attempts, forays into the passive world, in which we worked with a smaller organisation in the UK. They were our lead partner, and we provided a lot of expertise around collections management and preservation and care. But what we did was we chose to put all of our ship models on this site to bring a building back into sustainable use. And within this building, we built a building within the building, which stored those collections. So we were starting to feed into our thinking that it was possible to come up with environmentally sustainable ways to care for our collection that sit alongside access. And it's often the case that what I hear is the passive approach works, but it's not good when you put it alongside access. But that wasn't what we were finding when we sent teams to look at what they were doing in other countries. So what we did by looking at those collections which we wanted to be most accessible and also those collections which were most vulnerable and needed the deepest storage was we looked at storage alongside our work on digitisation. So just putting something in to store can be quite a limiting choice. And particularly with our film and photographic collections, our future investment in cold storage is making an equal investment in digitisation and cold storage side by side. So this is Rosie in one of our beautiful server rooms, and we tasked the team around digitisation of the collections to work in parallel with the same budget to understand what that could mean. One of the things they brought to it was a whole new set of metrics. So we were really used to thinking about our storage space in terms of cubic meters and square meters and linear meters, and we talked about concepts like yield, but we're now also working equally in petabytes and the interplay between the two. What happened when we let those two teams, who wouldn't normally be connected, connect, is we found that there were real opportunities for savings, and by reducing our physical storage footprint, we were able to release budget for digitisation or release budget for new builds passive solutions. So this is Rebecca, who is very proudly sharing the fact that she emptied a whole building by removing triplicate copies of film and video, which we didn't need once it was digitised. We are quite lucky, and a really simple thing I would advocate for you all is make sure that you have got rolling storage data. Maybe an audit every 5 years so you know about your collection's growth and your collection's use side by side. It's quite common now for me to be asked in the UK to look at other people's projects and comment on their viability, and this is always the thing that is missing, and what that leads to is an overinvestment in space, and it's frankly often the thing that makes a project too expensive to succeed. We used that data, and Mark will talk more about this, to design the building in the optimum size and shape. So once we knew a lot more about our collection, it was really possible to make really cost-effective decisions about that. And that's why our new building and our proposed cold storage solutions are so affordable. But perhaps the greatest thing we did with the risk work and with our staff directly was look at the published standards. I'd been lucky enough to be the expert on some of the developments of British and international standards, and I had a very strong sense that they're very generic, and in order to implement them really well, it's really important that you look at your own organisation, the risks that are likely to happen with your collection and in your organisation. So I'm going to share an example of where we've deviated from a standard over a number of years, and that standard is about materials. So in a lot of standards, you'll find a lot of information about the size and the strength and rigidity of things like racking. So this is our art store, which was quite an early project for us. And we made a decision to switch from steel to aluminium racking. That wasn't just cheaper in terms of buying the racking, it meant that the floor loading of this unused shelving system was nearly half of what it would have been with steel. So it enabled us to use a different floor in our building and therefore to get more content in. And I don't think as a sector, we are always dynamic and lively enough in our thinking about material use. We also have used lighter and lighter weight storage as we've gone through. So this is an example of where we stripped the weight from the end panels of our storage, and this built a lot of confidence. Our archival staff and librarians always had this great fear that things would fall off of the end of our shelving. But actually, when it came to it in practice, we discovered so much of our collection was boxed that this wasn't a requirement. So in our new storage, we simply removed that material, and that fundamentally reduced the cost, but it also reduces the amount of carbon in the production of that shelving. So it's really worth thinking quite carefully. And I think being brave, you are your organisation's experts. And I think that too often we fall into the trap of feeling really obligated to follow the standard, when in fact, if we know our staff and we know our collections, we can do things which are actually much better. One of the things that we've done at IWM is we've streamlined all of the environmental requirements into 5 very straightforward categories. And what we've found about doing that is it's far more successful when we work with other companies, either internal service providers or companies like Architype, when we've been developing new approaches. And over time, we've got more and more comfortable with the passive approach because we're seeing more and more evidence that it does exactly what we want it to. I thought it was fun to just share a little bit of our journey with you from 2009. So we saw pictures from our art store, which was an internal reconfiguration of space. And you can see here what we're spending per square metre. And you can also see here how we're getting that cost down in real terms if you consider inflation and all of the other factors we're all facing, by just really consistently sticking with the logic of learning the lessons from past projects, travelling widely and finding out what the best approach can be. And Mark will show you a great slide that compares, in the UK space at least, what we would expect, and we're now consistently below the expectations. I would also really advocate for trusting your own people. They know your spaces. They have skills and capabilities that you forget as a senior person who doesn't always see them doing their best work. So this is a great example. I sent the team off to look at other reference sites, and they came back with this photograph of the biggest plant room in a museum archive I've ever seen. This is one corner of it. We could have had a party in it. It was so enormous. And they came back and they were completely clear that they didn't want equipment like this. And they didn't want it because they didn't feel that our teams would always maintain that equipment properly. So the idea of the passive house approach that we ended up with was really from our service teams going and looking at other stores that were spending a lot of money to meet very precise standards and coming back and saying, really, I don't think we're going to do this. So we prefer the passive approach because we feel like we're less likely to fail. I think the other thing that we did well, and our technician team are always happy to connect and talk to technical teams in other places now, which is one of the great things that's come out of it, is that we trusted in the working practice. So there are other speakers who are going to talk about our work with barcoding. We, in fact, I went to Australia nearly 20 years ago now because they had implemented barcoding, and we looked at that very extensively, and then we chose to do it. And that gives us a lot of accurate information about our collection size and its movement. We're not the leader in that field now. I know the Science Museum have done some more work with Axial developing this product. But I think it's important that if there's something that's standing in your way and your team know that, just be brave about pushing at that boundary. So in the same way as we worked in partnership with Architype on this, we've also worked successfully with others. The technicians specified things like the loading bay for this project. I didn't even go to the meeting. I don't think Mark did either, but we'll check that in a moment. They do know how to move objects. And I really think interfering with that is a mistake. They also went out, so you can see here, they went out to look at the loading bay door. The loading bay of this building had to do lots of different things. It had to be the plenum for our plants. It was on the corner of a very exposed site, so we needed to be able to move through it and for the door not to be blown off, which happens on some of our other buildings. So again, just trusting those staff to really sign it off and come up with something really lightweight, minimising materials, and really giving them the confidence to say, yes, that will work. We're confident it will work. So our approach really has been to take any and every piece of advice from everybody else and apply it. And so we must now share that with you all. I'm going to let Mark talk through the design approach, and then I think we should be able to have a nice conversation and pick up your questions about the more technical elements, particularly around environment. Mark.
Thanks very much, Gail. Thanks for that presentation. You'll see if you look on the chat box, you've got some nice compliments there. And please, can I remind people, if you do have any questions, if you could type them into the questions box, please, and then we'll do our best to answer them, as Gail says, at the end. So delighted to be here sharing our experience. So thank you for the opportunity and thank you for attending. I'm Mark Barry. I'm one of the 3 directors at Architype. Architype are a practice that have specialised in low energy and healthy buildings and for the last 36 years. And up to about 8 years ago, we were predominantly doing that for people. So it was quite a shift for us to move over into the cultural sector and work. But what we found, and hopefully you'll see from the information that we share with you today, there are many shared benefits of getting good, healthy environments for people, as there are artifacts as well. So Archetype's work in those last 36 years has predominantly been about performance and minimizing completely eliminating the performance gap, which unfortunately is all too prevalent in the construction industry in the UK. And typically buildings will use 3 to 5 times as much energy as the designed figure is for them. And as a result, quite often we're finding buildings are unreliable and are delivering inadequate internal environments. And also systems are becoming more and more complicated, and therefore buildings more difficult to control. So part of the integrated approach that we've taken, and which is absolutely underpinned by those processes that Gail's just mentioned about co-developing building parameters with the design team, understanding building usage, and critically understanding operational procedures as well for the buildings. We utilize our specialisms in using evidence-based approaches. So that's employing strategies that we know work with our buildings, but also critically applying those working alongside with physics. It's much easier to work with physics than fight against it. And then delivering in a fabric first approach, so concentrating on thermal performance and air tightness, which ultimately minimizes the risk of plant failure because we're providing passive environments. And critically, we are challenging standards as we go. We are confident in how our buildings will perform, and I'll demonstrate through a couple of examples shortly about how we've successfully challenged and influenced those standards that have come out since our first work in this area. Now, we came into this sector in an unorthodox way. But when we crashed into that sector, we found that our first project, which was Herefordshire Archives and Records Centre, had recently had its budget slashed to only 55% of what at the time the Arts Council were recommending for a building of that nature. So originally we thought, well, actually, is this project possible? But because we hadn't worked in that sector, we went with the client to have a look at other recently completed and celebrated facilities. And actually, we were shocked to see that a number of them were performing a lot worse than anticipated, and some of them were actually had got strong rooms that were simply unusable, and these were buildings completed within a year or two. And we found that there were common design flaws with those projects, and often facilities are a combination of habitable buildings and storage, and typically habitable buildings will need habitable elements of the buildings need to be delivered with a temperature that's higher than the cooler storage. So, and often those habitable accommodation would be positioned on the ground floor. It makes it's logic to do that with the strong rooms placed above. But what we were finding through anecdotes and observations as we went round is that the heating from the ground floor habitable rooms was actually bleeding through the structure and warming up the cold stores above. And then what would happen, we would have, the response would be from the very clever active systems, the chillers would then kick in and then send cool back down to the habitable accommodation. And you then had created a war that neither system would win. So our radical but simple solution at HARC, the Herefordshire Archive, was to simply set the building out and isolating each of the different environmental standards, and critically insulating each of those buildings or semi-detached elements of the buildings very well, including the wall between the two. The project was completed in 2014 and has been an incredible success. And the I'll share with you the performance from the buildings, but the target energy bills have been met, and also the target performance met too. Now, critical to moving towards a passive solution is understanding the building physics around environments. And one of the things that we decided to do, very much inspired by the good work that had happened in Denmark previous to our introduction to the sector, it was allowing the temperature to move and fluctuate across the year in order to keep a constant level of relative humidity throughout the year. And this graph just demonstrates how, if you allow a building to free run, a building that is well insulated and airtight, between a temperature of 13 degrees and about 20 degrees, then that will prove without any, or that will deliver without almost any intervention, a steady RH throughout the year. We've called this modified conservation heating, because it's actually allowing the temperature to drift lower in the winter. And what that does is give a very, very stable environment from which it'll deliver a temperature change of about 1 degree per month through the year. And what we normally do is we ensure that the temperature there doesn't fall below about 13 degrees, which is quite easy to do passively in the winter. And that's just to avoid what is often quite a complicated process of humidifying air in stores. So that's why the blue line there flat lines at 13 degrees. And then what we do to manage the potential increase in humidity across the summer months is actually trim a very modest air supply into the building. But ultimately what we're doing is working with the physics. This is what a free running archive, i.e. zero energy archive, would be doing, and we try to adhere to that wherever possible. And ultimately doing that creates a fail-safe approach. In the passive stores that we've delivered, that they do have a tiny bit of active kit. It's a fan delivering equivalent amounts of air, equivalent to a kitchen, a domestic kitchen fan. It's really, really incredibly low. And if kit does fail, then the impact on the environment is incredibly slow. And allows people plenty of time to maintain. So this is an actual reading from HARC a couple of years after we'd completed the building, and what this is showing is an absolute flat line in the temperature there, just around 15, just starting to tail off through the month. But it's also showing, and it's also showing a relatively stable RH between 45 and 50%, but it is showing signs of some fluctuations in RH, which is due to that tiny amount of incoming air bringing in the moisture from the outside. So what we did the following month is actually do an experiment, which is we reduce that already tiny supply of air to see if that would level out the RH graph, and it did absolutely do that. You could see it was an almost instant response. But what it also did was show that in that subsequent month, the RH rose by about 1%, which is it's not alarming. And what we did is respond by turn the volume of air back up again. And what that told us is that the building hadn't fully completed, hadn't shed all of its construction moisture. So again, it was literally turning a simple dial. It wasn't trying to break a calculated BMS code. And then what we've done is layered up the annual RH and temperature graphs from those, from that building, and it shows modest changes, but very, very aligned performance through those years, and a really steady, well-controlled curve, particularly for temperature, but also the RH as well, bearing in mind that the bandwidth shown highlighted there is between 40 and 60%. Now, the other thing that we researched and were able to implement in our designs, and this particularly influenced how we moved on to design the paper store for Imperial War Museum, is that we soon realized that actually if there is a paper-based collection, then the moisture content of that collection adjusts or has an ability to maintain moisture far more readily than RH. So a change in 1% in EMC is 13 times the amount of a 1% change in RH. And we calculated that the maximum amount of water imbalance with the store that we were designing was about 10 kilograms of water per day. So if you multiply that out by to a typical month, that would manifest in a typical change of about 0.2% change in EMC, which only relates to 2.6% change in RH, and that's the maximum imbalance between water, which is in the depths of winter. So it was proving actually that the collection does most of the buffering, and where the standards and the guidance suggests that you are to use a hygroscopic construction, and we did that for HARC. Actually, where you've got a paper-based collection, there is moisture will find the passage of least resistance, and it will therefore be absorbed into the collection before almost all building fabric build-ups. And then again, what we've done with our buildings, because these sorts of buildings haven't been done before, we have put probes into the buildings. We've put probes under the floor with Imperial War Museum, because we want to understand about construction moisture and the speed of drying out, because again, we developed a system for both of our projects, new build projects, that avoided the need to have temporary tents above the our buildings, which is often an expense to a project that can drift into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. So we developed a system that we were confident would be able to dry out quite quickly, and we've gained in the last few years a much more clearer picture of how buildings behave, archives behave in the drying out process, and we've been able to optimize our equipment further in subsequent projects. And in doing all this, we are hitting world-class performance with our buildings. So the Herefordshire delivered for the archive bit only 0.04 air changes per hour, which is approximately 250 times more airtight than building regulations. And the real skill I feel in what we're doing here is delivering this with really simple construction, but just thinking about how it's built, and in this situation, working with the contractor to co-develop details. So we've got continuous lines of air tightness, etc. And we managed to better that performance with the Imperial War Museum project through lessons learned. And also what we've done, because external air incoming into the archive is the only really source of potential pollutants, and certainly the source of unwanted moisture, we've drastically reduced our air changes down in our buildings. And historically, though, they have been required because of the risk of stagnant air. And the thermographic image on the right-hand side of this slide shows how even the temperature is in our buildings. There's no variation in colour with that thermographic image. And the the text there shows that we've got pretty stable images, temperatures and RH throughout our stores. The only reason why the ground floor is slightly lower temperature at HARC is because of some ground connectivity. And then in terms of the design for the Imperial War Museum, we were fortunate enough to have a large site that we could optimize the building design with. But what we decided to put is predominantly put it on a single story, so that the ground could be coupled to the archive could be thermally coupled to the ground. And because Gail and her team were very keen to deliver lower temperatures, at lower temperatures of their selected bandwidth, we basically we eliminated the insulation between the building and the ground, so that the ground acts as a chiller plate in the summer. The ground floor is about 12 degrees in the summer, so it's cooling the archive passively, and then in the summer it's actually used in reverse. It's used as a low temperature radiator when the temperature's lower outside. So it was predominantly on a single story, but we also laid it out so that there was maximum efficiency from a central circulation route. We also made sure that the racking length was optimized as well. So it was the maximum run for that particular racking type in either direction, but also the superstructure of the building was designed so that the structural bays were absolutely meaning that our roof loadings were delivered with a minimum amount of material and therefore carbon as well. And what that does is create a cellularized building which actually inherently delivers safeguarding, because we're subdividing up into cells. And then this is the graph, or the graphs that Gail was talking about, which shows how we go from, it's a sort of a crude life cycle costing infographic. On the left-hand side, we've got HARC, where a gross internal area of 3,250 square meters. We then apply the actual cost rate of 1980 pound a square metre, and that's a turnkey delivery, and that gave us a project cost of 6.4 million, and then compared to the Arts Council recommended cost for a scheme at that time, we're already looking at a saving of about 5 million. But then critically, the on costs as we go into the next 25 years, with HARC it's estimated to be around £500,000 with a healthy inflation rate for fuel, compared with an average of the study projects that we reviewed at the beginning of HARC that showed several £1 million worth of fuel being used in those 25 years. So again, on a total saving at the end of 25 years of 8.3 million just on capital and fuel bill operational costs. And the same calculation on Imperial War Museum gives us a saving of about 5.4 million in that 25-year period as well. And there's also there are other savings like maintenance costs that aren't factored into here, and also critically FM costs as well. Some of the archive buildings that we work on for new clients have full-time FM managers just trying to keep environment stable on that building. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and thanks for staying with us, and we would be delighted to be able to answer any questions that anybody has.
Super, Mark. We've answered a few as we've gone through, but I've got two from Rosie Lee Power. And Rosie is particularly interested in how we've achieved passive control in old buildings, we haven't actually showcased one of those examples very comprehensively this morning, but we have got experience of doing that. And also how we go about sealing concrete. Would you like to answer those questions for Rosie Lee?
Yes, sure. So with our sealing of the concrete, we apply an epoxy finish to the concrete, so it actually doesn't. It actually throttles the speed in which the moisture is released from that slab, because what you don't want to do is allow the construction moisture, when it's drying out, you don't want it to overwhelm the minimal amount of kit that you have, and certainly you don't want to oversize the kit, the dehumidification kit, to cope with just the first 1 or 2 years of drying out. So yeah, that's what we do, and it's part of the reason why we probe our buildings and measure how quickly it's shedding its moisture content, is so that we can use our details like the epoxy paint finish to throttle the drying out of the process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great example, Mark, of where the passive approach actually works in your favour. So if anybody's interested in technically, we did all of the ODI testing and made sure that it was a conservationally sound approach, so we can share that if you'd really like to see it. But before this project, I actually did a project where we couldn't load the building for about 9 months because it didn't dry fast enough. And actually, this approach means that your building will dry in a much more controlled way, and you can control that. And for most of us, we're working in situations where we need a new building or a new storage area available at a certain date, because we're moving out of a space that's going to be used for something else, or that we can't afford to rent anymore. So I think that's a really useful thing to bear in mind about this approach.
I think so. And then if you're programming the delivery of a building, then what we've found, and working with organisations like National Archive Inspector, is that there's much more confidence in passive buildings earlier on. So if you can manage the building so you can start to demonstrate stable environments earlier on, you can actually take possession of your building earlier, which is, as I say, it can work very well with our clients to do that.
Yeah, great. So there's a follow-up question from Rosie, as well as some nice compliments for you, Mark, about the fact that what they're trying to do is repurpose an old food factory for archive use. And she's interested in our wisdom on that. Rosie, I would start by saying it's entirely doable, so stick with it as an approach. We've successfully delivered quite close to passive in Second World War barrack blocks, which have lots and lots of windows and are just, you wouldn't start there. So, very happy to share more of that, maybe if you want to email me, but I'll let Mark talk a little bit more about his experience of repurposing. Like me, I know Mark has seen lots of projects in Denmark in particular, where they have taken really, really basic buildings and done this.
Yeah, thank you. So Architype have been involved with more existing archives than the new builds, actually. So we've got a good level of experience in that sector. And actually, Rosalie, just looking at your question, the key, or one of the key words that I picked up on there is old, because it's what we've found with our buildings as we've been up and down the UK working on and trying to look at how we can bring existing archives, improve the environmental quality, and reduce the amount of energy needed to run those. We found that older buildings, often those ones without insulation, if they're built solidly, can actually, they're performing in much better ways than some of the new purpose-built archives that may have quite a bit of insulation in them. Now, one of the things that we're finding is that it's the air tightness. It's certainly a combination of air tightness and insulation that are key to delivering successful low energy archives. But actually, if you're well insulated, and again, this is down to the building physics, but it's a leaky building, that the cold, the internal air will find its way out through leaky doors or gaps in the building fabric. So, and that's actually more problematic than actually having a poorly insulated building, which will need a bit more insulation, or it will need a bit more energy because of its lack of insulation. But air tightness is the key there. And what we found in our experience is that actually the older buildings, because they tend to be solid brick warehouses or whatever it might be, we've had much more noticeable results where we deal with those. So I would definitely say think about air tightness as much as you think about insulation. People have in the past spent an awful lot of money trying to upgrade or reap better improved performance by investing an awful lot of money on insulation and forgetting or overlooking air tightness. So that's probably the biggest sort of tip I would say. But actually, if you wanted to email me, or if anyone wanted to email me or had a question for Gail after the session, then my email is mark.barry@architype.co.uk, and I'm sure we can share our contact details, or you can request them through the supplier of this conference as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mark. We've had a note from Tom saying that we're very nearly out of time. So I hope that was really useful for you all. And yeah, please get in touch. We'd love to share more of our work with you all.
Okay. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. See you.